Okay, so we might make a start. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Dig Deeper webinar. It's a great honour to be having Tony Hodge here speaking to us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands on which we meet right here in Brisbane, which is the Jagera and Turrbal people, and also to extend that acknowledgement to all the lands on which we meet across Australia and beyond. So I will just spend a few moments to introduce Tony now. So Tony is an adjunct here at the University of Queensland Sustainable Minerals Institute and also an adjunct at Queen's University in Canada. He has a long career in supporting the mining and sustainable development agendas, actually really all around the world. He was a core member of the Global Mining Initiative in the early 2000s, and he has also been president of Chair of Friends of the Earth Canada. Tony was the Canadian Prime Minister's roundtable representative from the Environment and Economy, and he has also served as president of the International Council on Mining and Metals, so the ICMM, which many of us are familiar. So look, it really is an enormous pleasure and honour to introduce Tony, and I will hand over to you.
Steve, thank you very, very much. I appreciate this opportunity to share my feelings and thoughts about closure and post-closure, which touch on issues that I've been dealing with for many, many years. Here at the University of Queensland, as Steve mentioned, we meet on the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Turrbal and Jagera people, where many generations have lived, now live, and will live in the years to come. I too honor all these and the land that is their home. However, part of the story I will share with you today is not about here. Towards the end of this presentation, I will be giving you material examples from a project and land far to the north of Canada in the Yukon, the Faro Mine Project. In 2017, I put the idea of learning about the life cycle story of the Faro Mine to a multi-interest community workshop in Whitehorse, the capital of the Yukon. Now, the Faro Mine Project was discovered in the mid-60s, ceased operation for the final time in 1998, and is today under regulatory review for its closure plan. Company owners have fallen away, and it is now the responsibility of the Government of Canada. There was much support for us to do this work, both by Indigenous and non-Indigenous Yukoners. So inside what I will share about closure and post-closure, there is another story, one that is not mine to tell. That story belongs to the Ross River people, whose traditional ancestral unceded territory is where the Faro Mine is located. The life, people, and community of Ross River were profoundly impacted by the Faro Mine, so much so that the Tahltan people to the south, knowing of the Ross River experience, have banned miners from their communities. Other First Nations in the Yukon also felt the Faro Mine through the transportation corridors, the electricity generation infrastructure built for the mine, through the Tantalus Butte coal mine near Carmacks, about an hour away, that was source of energy for the Faro Mill through the 1970s. For all these people, this is their land. I also recognize and honor their ancestors, their elders, all those living today, those yet to be born, and the land that is their home. I'm born in Vancouver, Canada, but my ancestors arrived from the UK in the 19th and early 20th century. We have much to learn from the First Nations, and I hope for an increasingly respectful sharing as we walk forward together. Now, the presentation today is focusing on the learnings that have come to me over the years about closure and post-closure. very, very recently, a colleague and I have published these documents, the Spanish version of which came out 2 weeks ago. So it's very, very fresh. And we opted to do something in order to generate debate, in order to enhance and encourage conversation about closure and post-closure. We've offered some definitions to clarify people's language. We've laid out what we've called a generic set of goals and objectives to guide closure and post-closure thinking. And we've articulated a series of questions that get at the issues that need to be dealt with. Now, there's a reason that we put them in the form of a question, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. I'm going to do something today, though, that I don't usually do, and that is I'm going to walk you through this systematically so that you understand what we've come to. Before that, I'm going to offer a few fundamental concepts that so you will understand where I am coming from. And at the end, I'm going to offer the example of Pharaoh to demonstrate to you the importance of what we are up to. It's only recently that people have been thinking about the full mine project life cycle. Now, this drawing is for a whole, I draw a whole bunch of information from this drawing, but I want you to look at it very, very carefully. And in particular, the shape in the middle, which is a conceptual outline of activity levels, might be employment, for example, or a number of people at the mine at any one time. Starts out with exploration. There's a peak of activity during construction, which many, many people don't think very much about. Then there's operations. Then there's a period of closure, which I will define, and then a long tail of post-closure, the length of which and the nature of which is very, very site-specific. But what we are learning is that as mining grew in size and magnitude in pursuit of efficiencies over the last 30 or 40 years, the implications for the long term expanded. And that tail for many operations is getting more significant than less significant. But to point out from this drawing, the key that I want you to know is that until the 1960s, really, quite frankly, there was hardly any conversation about closure, except that people looked at infrastructure and the opportunity to sell off equipment, generate some income from that, and oftentimes would walk after that. It was only in the 70s that people started thinking about closure. And quite frankly, what dominated thinking was the idea that you could rehabilitate land, which really translated to putting a bunch of soil on, hoping that the vegetation would come back, perhaps seeding it so that it would come back more quickly. It's only in the 2000s, that's only 20 years ago, that people began to think, what about this long-term issue? Those concerns by that time had been picked up, certainly in civil society, and who were arguing that there should be attention paid to that. Concerns in communities were certainly felt at that stage, and I will come back to that, but rigorous treatment from a technical and social perspective of the post-closure phase is a very real, recent phenomenon. So we have a lot to learn. I'm not going to give you a lot of answers to everything today. I'm going to share some thoughts on how we might get there. Just for your interest, fundamental to my thinking, which underlies everything that I'm going to say, is a sense that we need to think about, in the end, what we're going to achieve with closure and post-closure. I would argue that this same construct should be guiding all of what we do, not only with mining, but human activity in general. And that is that the purpose of what we are doing out here, ultimately, is to leave a legacy that's good for people, and good for the environment. Now, that's not rocket science. It actually is the fundamental basis of the earlier concept of sustainable development, which said we should be doing today things that are good for people and the environment, and not things that undermine people and the environment in the future. But that sense of driving and setting as a design criteria the achievement of a contribution to people and ecosystems is not ingrained in our thinking, quite frankly. We have intellectual constructs to deal with environmental or social concerns or economic concerns, but our testing and our putting in place systems to know whether or not we are succeeding in achieving human and ecological well-being remains to be refined. And in doing this, there are certain considerations that come into this. One is that we have to look not only at the substance of what we are doing, the technical issues. We have to be profoundly caring of the processes that we use to design and make decisions about what we are doing. Secondly, we have to look not only at the immediate and short term, but we have to start learning about how to deal with the long term. And I will argue towards the end of my presentation that the engineering design philosophy that is appropriate for the short term needs to be modified to deal with long-term design questions. And in that bailiwick, we have to think about a different approach to economic analysis, and in particular, costing, and in particular, ensuring that the resources that will be needed to see that needed obligations are dealt with over the long term are in place, human and financial resources. We need new thinking here. And thirdly, the only way that we are going to be able to do this for the long term in particular is that we commit to a fundamental approach of continuous learning, of realizing that we don't know all the answers now, that in fact what we are doing in these long-term facilities really amounts to an experiment. It has to be treated that way. We can have an hypothesis. It doesn't mean we don't do anything. We can have an hypothesis, but we need to put in place systems to understand that our hypotheses that we are putting in place to guide the design and implementation and operation of tailings facility in particular, and mine closure and post-closure in general, that is considered, that we test the hypotheses, we put in place the monitoring systems and test it and be prepared to test that and realize that as good as our designs might be, the needs of the site itself will change. There are too many unknowns. The degree of risk is too high. I'll come back to that also. And just on this drawing in particular, I've made a little comparative drawing on the right-hand side to the current popular flavor of the month, which is ESG. There are fundamental issues here that are missing in the ESG construct. Now, I'm not going to go into those today, but it's very, very interesting to see that some aspects of this are weak. And they're weak because instead of this being something that is driving results-based management, what we are doing is identifying 3 bundles of issues that need managing. So this is a mechanism, as it's being used today, for companies to manage issues. That's different than putting in place a results-based management system that is demanding that what we are doing is actually seeking and achieving human and ecological well-being. Closure. What is closure? Closure formally ends at the end of the operations. It includes all sorts of things: implementation and worker and community transitions, removal of extraneous physical plants, site grooming, construction of long-term needed facilities, for example, water treatment, implementation and testing of the monitoring system, preparing for the long term. Now, while formally this phase of activity ends at the end of operations, the beginning of activities feeding closure starts right back at design, at the beginning of that drawing. I would argue, in addition, something that we're just exploring right now, that the exploration aspect of a site and the exploration geologists and geoscientists have a great deal to offer in terms of adding insight to the knowledge base that makes closure more effective and more efficient on the long term. So what is post-closure? Post-closure is the phase that starts after everything is ready for the long term. Listen, the boundary between the two is not a black line. It's a gentle boundary. It's a vague boundary. But the reason it's useful to identify is that the mindset changes, and most importantly, the people responsible often change. One of the issues that mining is dealing with right now is the realization that the explorers, the designers, the construction people, the operating people, the closure people, and the post-closure people are all different. And we have a great deal to gain by bringing integration across that system and putting in place systems that ensure that knowledge is shared throughout the project. That's not been done in the past, and we're still a long way from there. So I've given you some examples of post-closure. It's the long-term operation of treatment facilities. It's the monitoring of ecological, physical, biological, biogenic, geochemical, and social conditions, and the assessment of our performance against socioeconomic and environmental obligations. Most importantly, on the long term, it means that we have to prepare to recognize changes in the performance of the system that are unexpected and have in place and ready mechanisms for adjustment so the adjustments can be made before a crisis occurs. That's a different engineering challenge than what we deal with when we build a building. We have to worry about avoiding a crisis, but in the systems that we are dealing with in mining, which are nested in geological, hydrological, so forth, physical environment, which we really don't know everything about. Listen, you got pinpricks and boreholes everywhere. You don't know what the whole system is. You have a groundwater flow system that you don't understand truly what is happening. You have a geochemical, biogeochemical system at work in tailings and waste rock that we've learned a great deal about, but for which there are many unknowns remaining. So there are a lot of unknowns. The system inevitably is not going to work exactly as we think it's going to. And what we want to be able to do as the primary engineering challenge, what we want to be able to do is recognize change and adjust the system before crises occur. This is particularly the case for the long term. Long term, what does that mean? Well, it certainly means decades, but what we're also learning to know, coming to know, is that it means centuries as well. And that's outside of the standard engineering mindset. I would argue that the overall goal of closure and post-closure is to achieve a positive legacy by ensuring a positive contribution to people and the ecosystems over the long term. Now, I work with a concept of goal that is overarching. Underneath, and to make manifest a goal like that, because after all, positive legacy is a values-driven phenomena. What you would think is positive or what I would think is positive might be different. You modify by a series of much more measurable objectives that are generally, but not always, but generally measurable. Now, this idea of an overarching direction and more specific objectives that then allow actions to be defined and actions which can be assessed in terms of your success. That's just a standard planning concept. But I warn you, this is a language issue. Interestingly, what I call an overarching goal in Europe would probably be called an overarching objective. And what I am calling specific objectives in Europe would be called goals. So I'm telling you how I am using this. I don't know what the right or wrong of them is, but just be very clear when you're talking to people that they understand the language that you are using. So I'm going to tell you about, I'm going to go through these objectives. These are generic objectives. These have been drawn from dozens and dozens of projects. And obviously in any site, the objectives have to be completely modified. I'm going to articulate these objectives in terms of achieving a maximum performance or a minimum performance. I'll come back to that at the end, because what you're going to see when you go through these, there are 12 of them. What you're going to see is that, and you're going to say to yourself, well, how can you maximize all of those other things and minimize all of those other things? Because they trend in the opposite direction. And that's a key issue to understand. So I'll come back to that. So, and ask yourself as we go through here, which of these would you not want to apply, if any? I think that's a real test of this. So people, the overall goal for people is to achieve a positive contribution to people and their well-being. I mean, after all, what's the point of a human activity that makes people's well-being worse? We're after one that's making it better. So 1, we want to maximize worker and public health and safety. It's a no-brainer. 2, we want to maximize opportunities for workers in the community to adjust to a post-operation society smoothly and fairly. We haven't done that very often. But do we not want to do that? No, that's again, these are essentially no-brainers. We've just articulated them because each of these, as you see when I go through, we can test whether or not programs and means have been put in place to achieve this. And if not, we can move to do something about that. And if in place, we can test to see whether actually they're functioning and performing as we would expect. And by the way, when we come to the questions, which is the next phase of my presentation, think about those questions that if you were a board member of a mining company, which of those, if you were a board member, would you not want to know about? Which of those, if you're the management team of a mining company, which of those of a community, which of those as a regulator? These are fundamental things that need to be put in place across our systems. Thirdly, we want to maximize local and regional socioeconomic, cultural, and health benefits. Well, we certainly won't want to minimize them. So we would like to do that. We would like to minimize restrictions on traditional and local land uses post-closure. And importantly, and I mentioned the importance, I mentioned the need for collaboration. We need to maximize engagement, dialogue, and trust building with all interest on issues and decision-making that is held by people that are either interested in or affected by this project. The mining industry is functioning right now with an ongoing trust deficit with society. There's a debate about how much, and it's not the same the world over, and in some countries it's not allowed. However, it's real and it's continuing. And the steps towards establishing trust is fundamental here. And I want to raise with you something that we have learned in closure and post-closure action. There are always different options for how you close a facility. They deal with these things that I've just laid out and the ones yet to come in terms of objectives. What we've found out is that oftentimes there's no perfect solution. For example, what's a closure facility, what might function very well in the long term might lead to significant risks what might function very, very well in the short term may lead to very high risks on the long term. Or conversely, what might function not so well in the short term might be expected to function very, very well on the long term. And there are cost implications of all of that. So you come and you make a decision about which way to go. Our experience has been that the community, the people, when you have a room full of multi-interests, and there are technical people, and there are government regulators, and there are Indigenous and non-Indigenous community people and environmentalists, and you mix them together and you work on the options. What is remarkable is that oftentimes the choice of the best approach, which ends up being a source of tremendous debate in the end, is not the real issue. The real issue is whether or not there will be available resources to implement the closure and post-closure plans when those resources are needed, the people and the financial resources to make it possible. There's a deep sense that we don't yet know how to bring surety about that availability of resources. And what we found is that in communities, people who aren't necessarily technical people who understand the generation of acidic water and contaminant migration off-site through various pathways, people understand that there's a vulnerability here. They understand, they may not understand why that sense is there, but there's a tremendous intuitive feeling of mistrust because of that lack of surety. And I have found that that is something that is shared not only just amongst community people, but if you really talk to the level of the regulatory system that is in that room, if you really talk to the technical people from the companies that's in that room, and the communities and the civil society organization, it turns out that everybody harbors a concern about that assurance. And we'll come back to that because it's a very fundamental issue. So let me go on to the environment. Obviously, the goal, the aspirational goal, is to achieve a positive contribution to the ecosystem over time, on the long term. And again, it's not rocket science. That's a lovely aspirational goal. Difficult to achieve, but it's a lovely aspiration. So what do you need in terms of objectives? We want to maximize, in any given facility, the restoration of a biodiverse and self-reproducing post-closure ecology within the area of influence or the ecological footprint of the mine operation. Pause on that for a second. Once we have created something as a result of human activity, this building, the University of Queensland, once we have built something here, it will never go back to how it was before. If the University of Queensland was removed itself from here, something new would be created. The environment itself would regenerate, but it won't be exactly as it was before. And so we're not going backwards here. We're going forward. How can we, with a closed mind, over the long term, create an environment which is biodiverse and self-reproducing in a way that works for itself? That's the challenge. We clearly, as an objective, want to minimize any off-site contaminant migration through all pathways, including surface water systems, groundwater flow systems, air transport, and biological transport. Now, one thing that many people outside the industry don't realize is that because of the nature of the mining process, we are creating the opportunity for biogeochemical processes that will lead to the release of contaminants, or may lead to the release of contaminants, that once unleashed by the mining process cannot be stopped. They can be managed more or less, but they cannot be stopped and will not be stopped because we've increased the surface area of the particles in preparation for milling and processing and getting the minerals out. But in the process, we are making that terrain available to all sorts of natural processes, which will continue forever. Now we can slow them down, but can we slow them down enough? And that's a real challenge that we continue to face. Obviously, also in terms of objectives, we want to maximize the stability of physical and biogeochemical storage of tailings, waste rock, slopes, roadways, waterways, etc. Again, this is not rocket science. We're raising these because they are part of what we need to ensure is in place in the closure and post-closure plans that are put together. Now, those are the end results. We want to achieve human and ecological well-being. We want to achieve stable site that is self-reproducing from a biological and ecological point of view. How do we do that? We put in place management systems to ensure that that can be possible. So we also need to track and have objectives related to the management system. We want to ensure that there is maximum confidence that a resilient system of management and oversight will be established for implementation throughout the full time horizon of closure and post-closure. It will change on the long term, but we need to design a system that can allow us, that can give us that confidence. We've not done that very often. We've not thought about that. Now, let me remind you that the post-closure phenomena has only been something on people's radar for about 20 years. That's nothing. When you think of the history and background of chemistry and physics, it's nothing. 20 years, a drop in a bucket, less than a drop in a bucket. That management system to give us the confidence needs to be in place. And for us to have confidence, we need to lay it out. We need to design it. We need to design it preferably collaboratively with all of the participants in the mine process. And so that we can understand that it's going to work. Or if it doesn't work, there is a means to adjust it so that it will work. And that will take resources that we're currently not putting in place.
Advance the slide.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. We need to have maximum confidence that the cost estimates will cover closure and post-closure requirements through the full life cycle. Do you know how are cost estimates currently being made for the post-closure phase of mining? For the most part, these very long-term costs are just simple projections of water quality treatment for very long periods of time, oftentimes using net present value calculations. And when you come to applying net present value calculations, when you go beyond about 15 years, it's hopeless. It doesn't give you something that's real. And we need to move past that. And right now, people realize that. And it is therefore offering another ingredient to people outside the mining industry, which is leading to a sense of mistrust and contributing to the trust deficit. We need to have maximum assurance that resources will be available to meet closure obligations when needed throughout the closure and post-closure phase of activity. And I mentioned that. Before, and I can't emphasize that enough. Now, those objectives were all articulated in terms of maximums or minimums. And the reality is that they don't all trend in the same direction. If you maximize one thing, you find that it's in conflict with something else that wants to be maximized. You can't maximize everything or minimize everything. And so in order to deal with options analysis and thinking about closure, these different objectives have to be laid out, and through, in my view, a process of very careful negotiation between the interests, you have to weight them. what's more important than another one? There are processes to do that, and I'm not going to go into that today. That could be source of an entire series of lectures to talk about how, but it's the bread and butter of decision analysis. There are ways to do this, and when you do it, remarkably, there are risks involved with each of these, and so risk assessment has to be part of this process. It's not trivial, but it's very, very important. And as you will see, we're coming to understand that in many, many cases, the post-closure activities, you're dealing with billions of dollars here. These are not evident costs upfront when you're dealing with immediate closure, nor are they upfront when you realize that these expenditures are going to have to happen after all the income from the mine is ended. There's no income unless the site is used for some other purpose. And there are people looking very carefully at that, particularly energy generation, I would argue. There are other options, but we're far from untangling that conundrum. The other thing I've mentioned that these questions that I'm now going to lay out for you, think about them if you were a board member of a company or part of company management. Think about them if you were a community, a regulator, a civil society organization. These are all questions that I think these people want to see taken care of. So these questions are split into two parts. And the reason is that some companies have many operations and some companies have one operation, and there's things in between. And how you deal with a company and its obligations when it has 35 operations is going to be a little bit different than when you deal with a company that has one operation. This is another area that is very delicate in terms of how you deal with closure and post-closure. The large companies that have large resources, levels of resources, arguably might be better able to deal with some of these costs. This is tension. This is a source of tension inside the mining industry, where the junior companies don't want to see these kinds of obligations simply putting them out of business. But it's a tension we have to deal with. And my own feeling is that I believe there's a role for small operators, there's a role for large operators. But untangling this particular tension, we're far from a solution on it. So this set of questions is looking at the head office. You would want to know what, if you were trying to test in your mind the ability of a company to address those 12 objectives that I just laid out, you would want to know what the policy is, fundamentally. What is the company policy? There are lots of companies out there that have no policy. That's changing. And there are certainly some companies out there that have very sophisticated policies now. Fundamental question is, what's its policy? Fundamental question is, what board oversight is in place to ensure that the right things are being done? Is it an individual? Is it direct obligation? Is there a committee assigned to this? Overall, what's the company oversight that's in place to see that the right things are being done? What's the corporate office role in this? And importantly, what if ownership change occurs? What happens if a big company sells to a little company? How are the commitments made for closure and post-closure that were accepted quite openly by the large company? What does that mean for the small company that's coming in? Is the liability, the terms of liability and the terms of closure and post-closure, are they attached to the land or are they attached to the operation or the company? So that if a new company comes in, the previous company can avoid the liability. These are delicate questions for which there is no simple answer, but these are questions that we have to ask as a society and find answers for. Questions about the company closure, post-closure plans. Again, this section is thinking of it from the head office. This is a head office perspective. I'm going to go to an operation perspective. And one of the issues, of course, is how operation and head office interact. Sometimes, which is great, sometimes it's not so great. So to the head office, we ask, how many sites are you responsible for? Some of the big companies today I'm aware of, there may be something between 100 and 150 sites that they are responsible for managing. A little company might have one site. If you have 150 sites that you're managing, it's way more difficult, way more complex. With those sites, how many of those sites are close to closure? How many of them are in closure? How many of them are in a temporary state? This is the closure pipeline that a company has to deal with. We think about a project pipeline up front. Companies do a lot of work to ensure a project pipeline, to ensure that their activities will continue long into the future. What about the closure pipeline? What does it mean? And how are each of these, which have different requirements, being treated by the head office, how well is it understood? Or is there stuff happening out there that it's kind of not on the radar? And it's going to come up and bite the company in the bum. And how many of the closure plans that are in place have been subjected to independent technical review by experts? And there's certainly within the professions, the implicated professions, there's discussion about how best to do that. And this has taken a big jump since the failures in Brazil and Canada and so forth a number of years ago. Questions about, again, the head office, company provision for closure and post-closure, this central issue. So what provision do you have in your statements, your financial statements for closure and post-closure? And in the calculation of those provisions, what time horizon is used? How does that relate, that time horizon, how does that relate to the obligations which fall to you? And what discount rates are used? And I'll come back to that, but we need to put this out in the public and discuss it so that people are aware of the calculations that have been made. How much do investors understand this so that they can understand the implications of this phase of mining activity to their investment in any given company? Interestingly, the investment community is waking up to this as well. It's coming out of the cupboard, quite frankly. And in terms of what's in the what's in your financial provision, how much of those objectives that we laid out earlier, how much of those are covered? And of those objectives, are the provisions that are there, how much of it is for the immediate couple decades and how much is it for the long term?
Just checking you're on track with time and
Thanks.
slide.
I didn't keep up in these slides also. Sorry, I'm on this. How much, again, let's see, I'm on question 12 up there. How much assurance is required by government? This is not simply a company responsibility. Government sets the rules. How much has been set by government? What is the rule set by government, and how much, how close is the company to being able to fulfill those rules? Or has government set any rules? If government has set no rules, what obligation is the company under, if any? So there's a shared responsibility in this game between governments and companies. What's the nature of the security that's been put in place? What's the credit rating of the company? And importantly, what happens if the company goes into receivership or bankruptcy? How much of closure and post-closure obligations will be covered? That's a critical issue because we've ended up with so many examples where companies have not been able to cover the security. Here. I'm going to go to the individual sites now, and I'm going to speed up through these. Some of these are reflective of what I've just said. What are the vision goals and objectives on site? Who's accountable? How mature are their cost estimates? And there's a growing and very powerful literature on the concept of maturity, and I refer you to some of the ICMM documents on integrated closure planning for that. What degree of stakeholder involvement has been achieved by the company in terms of management and decision making? How much risk-related planning and assessment has been created? And within those analyses, what assumptions and residual risks are key to the calculations at site? We need to bring those things out into the open. Parallel to the thinking on the earlier section of the corporate head office, what is the assurance requirement that that has been put in place by government for that site? What discounts rates have been used and what time horizon has been used? We need to know that to know whether or not we're well prepared, which is the essence of these questions. What parts of closure and post-closure are covered by permits? Are there other policy requirements the government has set? Are there any cost sharing or mechanisms that have been put in place that are important to understanding the situation at a given site? So again, we need to look at a series of things and ask in terms of the closure and post-closure issue, what is the contribution to people and well-being and their well-being over the short and long terms? Safety, transitions into post-closure, community and activities for workers, sociocultural implications, health benefits, cultural and socioeconomic benefits. What's going to happen in terms of post-closure land use? About the environment, what programs are in place to actually restore a biodiverse and self-reproducing post-closure ecology? What's in place to ensure physical stability, biogeochemical stability, acid and melliferous drainage, and associated water treatment? These last three things, physical stability, biogeochemical stability, and the AMD-ARD issue, this is what's preoccupied people, but there's much more to it than that. Site costs. What is the cost estimate for closure of a given site? What are the high-risk elements? What's the degree of completeness and maturity and accuracy of that cost estimate? And have they been subject to independent review by experts? If you were a board of a company, you would want to know answers to those questions. They're exactly the same questions that the community would want to know. They're exactly the same questions that the regulator would want to have answered. And importantly, what's the financial provision for closure and post-closure at that site? What's the balance sheet provision? What objectives does it address? What discount rate and time horizon was used in its determination? Those are the questions that we've laid out for people. The answers are not simple. I'm going to show you one aspect of this by drawing on the Faro mine in the north of Canada, which, as I mentioned in my introduction, the closure plan is now in regulatory review as we speak. This is not a huge amount of data, but I pulled it together to show you the implications of what we've got before us. In this particular case, I'm going to look at the federal government contribution to that mine from its beginning in the 60s to today, extending through the next 25-year period of closure, which they're now moving into, and then projecting out across the post-closure phase. And in this case, I've just arbitrarily chosen 500 to 1,000 years, which is the time horizon that is included in the material that has been put before the regulatory agencies. So remarkably, can I get rid of this?
Yeah.
You can see that the documented historic expenditures, and these are federal government expenditures, and they're particularly important because this has been a federal government responsibility as a regulator, and now is a federal government responsibility as a proponent of the subject of the project. So in the first 30, 40 years of its activities, the federal government contributed about $2.4 billion. It seems a lot. Actually, there are reasons behind this, and I'll show you, I'll talk about those reasons in a second. There is some very good work that's been done on looking at the costs of putting the closure system in place over the next 25 years. And it amounts at this point to 1.2 billion, although there are a bunch of things in there that are missing. So these numbers you will see are conservative. And they have taken the water treatment costs of $4 million a year, I think it is. And they have projected that using present value calculations into the long term, 500 or 1,000 years. They've used a 3% discount rate to do that. These numbers are in the material sitting before the regulatory. And if you apply present value calculations to that, it turns out that because the nature of that particular calculation, in about 20, 30, 40 years from now, they disappear. And so it turns out that whether or not the time horizon is 500 years or 1,000 years, the estimate for post-closure cost is about $172 million, which is crazy. It's not real. But that's the general standard and accepted approach to dealing with long-term costs that we currently have in place. Of these numbers, about 28% of the federal government contribution is for infrastructure, about 2% went to direct operational support, and the majority of it is for environmental remediation and post-closure activities that have had to be put in place or will be put in place through that mine. Now, if you take those numbers away from NPV calculations and you just project $7 million a year over 500 or 1,000 years, these are the numbers you get. So it comes up with you come to a number that says that post-closure costs are going to be in the order of 6 to 8 million. And this is the other numbers are the same. So this is the comparative cost analysis for the post-closure period over 500 to 1,000 years, whether you use a 3% discount rate or a 0% discount rate. Now, I'm not saying that these numbers, particularly the 0% discount rate, are going to be what they are. But this is the current state of our capacity to calculate these costs. They are not pinned down. There are issues in the post-closure. We're not applying the same mentality to the post-closure period as we are to the exploration period, the operation and construction period up front, and even the closure period in the next 25 years. We're not doing our homework the way that we could. And these are the numbers that demonstrate that very, very clearly. For example, in 500 to 1,000 years, there will be short-term geomorphological changes occur on site. We know that. It's further made more complex today because of climate change and what we're experiencing in Northern Canada and across the world because of climate change. Are we bringing to bear the geomorphological expertise that geoscientists have and thinking this through from that point of view so we can understand what systems we will have to put into place to ensure the physical and chemical stability of that site? No, We're not doing that yet. It's not that we can't do it. We can do it. It hasn't got into the requirement yet. And these are obligations that we will have to start doing. Now, just for interest, last week I was at Newcastle University, and these are the numbers that are included in the Hunter Valley restoration book that shows an estimate of the funds that are in place for the long term relative to the funds that are estimated to be required. Now, I don't know the details of these calculations. People have to look at these. And they may be not quite right, but my sense is that they're probably indicative of a major issue, and they have to be taken seriously and perhaps looked at in much greater detail. It turns out, quite frankly, it turns out that the nature of engineering and economic thinking on the long term has to change. Our boundary conditions for the engineering problem are different than for the short term. The degree of in the spatial and temporal boundary conditions are different. I'm going to miss number 2 because that would be a whole lecture in itself, but there's some very interesting and important issues related to the application of factor of safety and probability of failure and engineering reliability that work on the short term and work really well for designing of a building like this. But when you're dealing with large scale external facilities located in a geologic environment, they don't work very well. The key from all of this, and in fact, in waste management facilities, there is a strong argument to be made that the way we design right now is a way that is actually designing for failure. We're not designing to avoid failure like an airplane or a bridge. We're actually designing for failure. It is inevitable, and we need to change our thinking about what that means in particular. Because of that, a different kind of thinking in terms of engineering design philosophy is required that says this is an experiment. There are so many unknowns here. Instead of designing for failure and pushing out the inevitable, which is what we're doing, we need to recognize that failure will likely occur, that we need to put in place systems as if this were an experiment. We know the process of experimentation. It's deeply embedded in scientific approaches. We need to think of this as an experiment and put in place monitoring systems and capacity to adapt in a way that we haven't done before. This is really tough. It's really tough because you're really saying that this is not a perfect solution. Politicians don't want to hear that. The public doesn't want to hear that. Graduating engineers and practicing engineers, they don't want to portray themselves as people that are giving a less than perfect solution. It's a psychological shift required here to deal with the reality of facilities like this in an honest and open way. And that's my final point, number 5 down here, is that there's a need for the professionals to engage more in the communication process, talk fully about the residual risks so the responsibility for decision-making is shared across all of us, because these are not perfect solutions. There's some specific issues of research that I want to briefly touch on here. This issue of projecting conditions and costs when time horizons reach into the centuries, we're not very good at that. We need to work on that. How long is this generation's responsibility? And I share an idea with you. It's not tested. There's no basis for this. The problem is, how can you even imagine 1,000 years out? We're not very good at that. We can't do that. And here's an area I believe that we may draw from Indigenous people's knowledge and suggest that our responsibility as a generation, maybe we should say, we will take responsibility. We will put in place the resources and ensure that we have the capacity to deal with issues from now until 7 generations out. And the next generation will push it another 7. And the next generation will push it another 7, so that we function within a rolling 7-generation responsibility. We need to look at something like that to see if there's a way through this that doesn't just blithely say that we're going to project costs out 1,000 years when we really know that they're imaginary at best. We need to look at this short-term build issue in terms of good design versus long-term performance, and introduce the idea of adaptive management to engineering design. These are difficult issues. We haven't done that well. In optimizing a mine site, which drives what happens currently, it's an economic optimization that is based on net present value calculations. We need to look at that in terms of community optimization, because community optimization will embody values and concerns that economic optimization doesn't embody. For example, if we have a 20-year mine, a 30-year mine, and we want to push it because that's what the economic theory tells us we should do, which, by the way, will always bring ore out of the ground to a state of mineral in hand and money in hand faster rather than later. What if for the community, it would be better to have an 80-year mine and a quarter of the workforce, but be more gentle socially and economically and environmentally? We need to test that. I don't know, we've never looked at those things in comparative terms. At what point does the concerns of the community lead to divisive action that will actually completely upset the economic optimization? How can we do that? Think about that differently. How can we look at the security of resources over the long term, not only in terms of the amount and how it's set aside, but the mechanisms that make that possible? And for mining, how do we deal with a level playing field where costs related to these long-term issues, which inevitably eventually need to be integrated into the price of the commodities, how do we achieve a level playing field for that so that the market is functioning globally in a way that isn't penalizing some companies in certain countries that are requiring these things to be dealt with relative to other operations in other countries where they don't have to deal with these issues? How do we get past that? I don't know the answer to that. But those are the kinds of questions that we need to deal with. So my plea is to see the forest and the trees, to look for it, and to seek a longer term perspective. So Tom, thank you very much. Or Steve, rather, sorry.
Tom, you got it right.
Tom.
Yeah. So look,
that's it. I might have gone on again.
Extraordinary seminar, extraordinary messages there, and we have time for some questions. So please do put your questions in the chat. But just while we're getting those ready, I actually noted quite a few questions myself, but I wanted to start with a comment rather than a question, but welcome your feedback on it. And it is actually on this question, timeframes, and and how you allocate the work. So I had the opportunity recently, and a group of us from CLC Time had the opportunity recently to visit a site in the Northern Territory where they're doing some rehabilitation and restoration work. And from a technical perspective, that could be done in 18 months. But in order to realise more benefits and to, let's just say, address outcomes of a more holistic nature and heal some of the damage which has been done previously, they've chosen to do that work over 6 years of works plus 5 years of monitoring. So they've taken an 18 months component of like what you might call technical work, spread it over, so they've done it over 4 times as long, plus added some extra time. And the whole purpose of that is actually to deliver much better outcomes
locally. And engage people in the process.
So there's time to train people to do more of the work locally, time to embed it in wider programs, time to connect it to a lot of kinds of different things, and to work to a different rhythm which is not a kind of a frenetic working through the night, kind of rhythm. So, but the interesting thing about that is it's not really a commercial venture. That's not it's not been done on a kind of a commercial basis that way. It's actually publicly funded that work. So I wonder, one of the things I'm quite interested in is there a case for that, to do that, more generally, more broadly, to do it on a commercial basis?
Really interesting issue. One of the things that's surfacing now is that governments are being faced with addressing costs like that, and they are questioning, and this is around the world, and we know that there are active mining activities in at least 140 countries around the world. Governments are now recognizing that these are issues that they have to look at, that they either have to be prepared to spend their own money on that, which is tax money, which is saying society is going to pay for this, or they have to put in place the rules that say, companies, you need to deal with this. There is a tension. And I think this certainly will be probably resolved on case-by-case basis, but I think the questions need to be posed, because someone has to pay for it. And right now we're kind of in the in-between time when company doesn't want to pay for it, government doesn't want to pay for it, community doesn't want to get left holding the bag. Nobody wants to pay for it. The reality is that our values have changed. We have now understood that the social and ecological implications of these projects need to be considered in a much more profound way. There will be real costs to that. Yeah. We need to share those costs in some way. The negotiation, which is what that is, about how to do that, is, I think, another area of research that we haven't resolved right now. We've fallen into it by default because nobody wants to pay. And it has set up, with the tension, it has set up, I think, a spirit of collaboration that is not always positive, when it could be a source of finding common ground and win-wins in a much more effective way. There's no simple answer to what you say. I mean, I think that's a very good example. In my mind, it's a very short-term example. I think that we need to look at these issues. I have asked design engineers. I got involved with a project in Northern Ireland, lovely mine project, has ripped the community apart, and asked the design engineers whether or not they would look at different mill rates, which drives the speed of the mine. Different mill rates so that it could stretch the production time out farther. The problem, of course, is that the company wants the money now because it wants to pay back its investment, because it's a small company. It wants to get more investment, wants to show success, get more investment, so it can do another project. Yeah. That's their lifeblood. And this is saying something that's exactly inconsistent with that. It's saying, let's slow this down. It means your profit's not going to be as fast. It means that you're not going to be able to pay back your investors as quickly. But it may mean that the community will be championing you because you integrated into the optimization process the values of the community. We need to look at that. We haven't looked at that.
So that actually brings me to another question which I had quite early on in the talk, and that was around ESG. And you noted some limitations of that term, and let's just say some shortfalls or some concerns. I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit and perhaps tell us how you see the implications of those limitations for the industry today and for the experience of mining in regional communities.
Well, yeah. The overarching limitation, from my point of view, is the concept of ESG and how it's being used by companies and assessors of the industry and investment communities. The investment community is that these are categories of issues that the company that, for example, the investment community would insist that a company deal with. And you tick them off. I mean, a checkbox exercise. Quite frankly, that's how the application really works.
Yeah.
And the score is achieved, this is higher or lower on ESG. It's useful from that point of view. It's a step forward from that point of view. But what I'm arguing is that the concept of human or ecological well-being, which you could argue is the environmental and social part, but concept of human and ecological well-being is not just a label, a bundle of issues. That is actually a driving goal to be achieved. And then the success of actually contributing to human and ecological well-being, not just completing the program, but actually achieving human ecological well-being, contribution to that, that you are using that to assess your success with. Now, the G of ESG, the governance issue, it's going to be specific to company, but one of the things that is very clear is that there are all sorts of aspects of governance that fall outside the market system.
For sure.
That we don't integrate into our thinking right now. There are all sorts of aspects of human activity that just aren't measured during the market system, nor therefore they're not governed by the market system. They may or may not be included in the governance system set up in companies. But I'm thinking now of housework. I'm thinking of all of the things that actually don't go into the calculation of our GDP and GNP numbers. I happen to think personally that GDP, GNP numbers are. It's a powerful way of testing the success of our market economy. But there's a whole bunch of governance related stuff that's outside that whole bailiwick that we need to care for. And I think it's the limitation. It's that kind of limitation that hasn't been thought through by making the ESG construct actually a design for results-based management of our systems, rather than bundles of issues that need to be managed for the benefit of reducing risk to the company, which is sort of the mindset right now.
Yeah, certainly. There's all kinds of unmeasured. I mean, this is well known in social sciences and economics. There's all these unmeasured elements of society which don't go to GDP and other formal measures, including voluntary work.
Sure, the voluntary work is huge. Companies, I'm always amazed that companies operating in some areas where the Indigenous community is strong, why they don't see taking on programs to strengthen the cultural fabric of the Indigenous people is just such a no-brainer to me. Generally doesn't cost a lot of money and with huge outcomes. Language programs, means of encouraging their own spiritual practices, which are important to them. May not be important to us, but are terribly important to them. We don't think those things through, and you could only do that by talking with the Indigenous people and letting them guide those processes.
Just a reminder that questions are welcome via the chat, but while I've still got the
there are no questions.
While I still got you there, Tony, there was one other kind of question I had, and I was really interested in your point around a mine site or an operation, or for that matter, a building like this one, will never go back to the way that it was before. That is actually just not possible. Yet, in a lot of our governance, a lot of our underlying policies, there is the assumption of restoration. There is the assumption of putting things back. There is an assumption of what I kind of sum up as return to prior state. It's the kind of term that I often use when you look at these kind of principles, and that seems to be a fundamental mismatch in terms of what is possible and what is desirable. So, do you have any kind of thought on that mismatch and the implications of this match?
It's a mismatch in the way that you express it, because people are looking at the wrong thing to restore. What needs restoring is the integrity and self-reproducing capacity of the ecosystem. That is a restoration, but it's not meaning going back to how it was before. So we think that restoring the painting is cleaning it off and making it perfect the way the artist created it. That's our concept of restoration. It's a different concept. You're talking about restoring system functions, not restoring the branch of the tree that was exactly the same as it was before.
Yeah.
So it's a different concept. It's something very well understood in ecological circles. Very well understood in ecological circles. Not so well understood in engineering circles. When you restore the capacity of a pipeline, you will measure that by the throughput that it was designed to achieve. You've taken it back, you've cleaned it out and put it back to the capacity that it had before. That's different than what we're talking about here. This is an ecological concept. It has got to do with restoring the capacity of the ecosystem to function as it wants to function. And that will be different.
Look, we do have a question which has just come in, and I'm just going to read it out. Might need a comment. So one of the issues that Gilling's interested in is a focus on trust building in the sector and government. It seems that the focus is outward rather than being trustworthy in the first instance, and realizing that while there are some common factors, what makes you worthy of trust can differ across contexts. Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, someone said to me yesterday, because I had shared a land acknowledgement that was similar to this in the presentation I made yesterday, that they felt that the words I had offered were authentic. And trust cannot be built through checkbox exercises. Trust has got to do with how you feel towards another party. It comes because you demonstrate that you are worthy of trust. And interestingly, in my experience, oftentimes in dealing with Indigenous people, they, I suspect, feel that capacity more easily than those of us who are non-Indigenous people and in a settler capacity. We write contracts and insist that you sign it so that I can hold it against you. It's a different thing. The trust that we're talking about that needs to exist between communities and companies and operations needs to come because, and I've lived in communities where the trust between mining company and community was very powerful. And it's remarkable when that occurs, but it comes because they are as much part of the community as the others.
Yeah.
And people feel them as part of the community. People feel that they're contributing to the community, that they are as much a part of it and wanting the benefit for the good of the community or the good of the environment as much as the rest of the other people in the community. And that comes with demonstration of what you do and how you are with others. You can't design it. You can't design it. And I think on the closure, post-closure issue, tremendous opportunity. I think these issues are costly. They're raising cost implications that are very significant. I think the only way through them is to do things collaboratively with people, and it's only through profound collaboration that the trust that's needed is in the end going to be generated.
So we've got a few, we'll wrap up very soon, but we do have a handful of just sort of final questions. And one is, what is the role of storytelling on helping to build a new vision for a post-mine transition? So how do you see the role of storytelling?
Oh, this is a wonderful question. The reality is that when you want to learn about a place or people that are in that place or around that place. You cannot measure it. You can get insights from measurement. When you undertake assessment processes, you actually go through a generic cycle that always occurs. Measurement, which we are besotted with in the academic community and with science and engineering and so forth, is actually not the starting point. It never is the starting point. The starting point is always storytelling. And interestingly, we're, as a society, it's an area where we can learn a great deal from Indigenous people, but they're not perfect either, by the way. And there's wonderful storytellers who understand what I'm talking about, who aren't Indigenous, but we can learn from Indigenous people, not only about generic technique, but in particular, of course, about particular places. You start with storytelling, and the power of measurement is that it tells you things that reinforces what part of the story you can take forward. Because story is a trickster too. Story is a trickster, and you need to learn to avoid the trickster and learn to pull from story what is really valuable. But even once you have story and you have measurement in place, you need to pull things together, and story and measurement can all be put into dollar signs. So you need different ways of synthesizing, judging, developing criteria, and making sense of what you've got. That's another skill that's required. And then, of course, the fourth step of the assessment cycle is to be able to communicate that effectively. And the way you communicate that to different groups in society will be different to be effective. So storytelling is at the heart, in fact, of everything that we do. If you're my boss and I come in for my annual review, do you say to me, Tony, you committed to make 5,000 telephone calls, write 43 reports, and go to 70,000 meetings. Have you done that? That's not what you do. You say, Tony, how do you feel about the year? What happened? Was it good? Was it bad?
What were the highlights?
What are the highlights? I tell you a story. We use it all the time, and we need to recognize that. But as I say, story can be a trickster, and you need to learn to be as rigorous with story as you do as we are with measurement. Measurement can be a bit of a trickster too sometimes. That's another story.
So this is the last comment and question. I'm going actually comes from Anna, who's here in the room. Did you want to ask it directly, Anna, or do you prefer me to read it out?
I hope everyone can hear me. Tony, just a quick question. I love hearing you talking about your work at Faro. Obviously, it's a site where, with the long history and sort of commercial interests have really departed. What would be different in doing the kind of work you've done at a place where there was still some fairly significant mining interests? Can you do it?
Yeah, there's lots to say about Faro that, of course, I've not touched on here, but the answer is yes. There's a disadvantage. The Faro project ended in 1998. It's far enough away that people feel free to talk about it. And there's a great reticence. And quite frankly, the issue of getting information data from the mining companies is a tough issue because legally, their legal people will say, oh, there's a risk in letting that out. We don't know the implications of it. We don't want to take the chance. So it's very hard to get the information. In the Faro case, because of the role of the receivers in the receivership and bankruptcy processes, we have a tremendous amount of data that we otherwise wouldn't have. So it's tougher. But I think it's inevitable that the companies who want to build the trust will see the benefit of this kind of analysis sooner rather than later. It's remarkably powerful. And in fact, I'm convinced that the companies do not have things to fear from if we are open about it. I think they have much more to gain than to fear. It's a toughie though, because the culture of the mining industry is hold your cards close to your chest. And in order to do what we did at Faro somewhere else, there's got to be an opening. There's got to be an opening in a way that is itself with integrity and respect. I'm convinced that there's more benefit to doing it than not doing it.
So look, we're going to have to leave it there. There was one last question. Do you think we can sneak a last one in? Yeah, we've got a couple of minutes left. So I'm just going to read this one out from Andrew Butler. Does the lack of preparedness of regulators to accept risk on behalf of us all discourage proponents from being able to fully explore and share long-term risks of failure? Something like a head in the sand approach. And does this prevent the development of standardized mechanisms to accept reality of inevitable failure and how to manage that?
Listen, this question is again, it's really, really important, and it raises something that I don't know the answer to, and it's not just the regulators who are afraid of dealing with risk. The government's caught in a squeeze. On the one hand, they have to set the rules and enforce the rules. Secondly, depending on the policy of the government in power at that stage, they are either going to be very effusive in their support for the mining industry, hoping for enhancing government revenues and jobs and so forth, or they're going to be less wanting to do that, depending on, quite frankly, how they were caught in the third function, which is to mediate when there are alternative values come into play. So they will moderate activity like mining in favor of other values that are at place in society. Right now, with climate change and the desire for people to deal with climate change, there's a terrific push to encourage mining activity. I hope not at the expense of things that we've learned about over the last number of decades. However, the lack of willingness to articulate risk and make decisions based on a realization that those risks will exist and it's okay for us to move forward. That's an attitude that is not limited to regulators. It's part of the regulatory system. It's very much part of the mining company. It's part of people in the community who don't want to have anything less than a perfect solution that will eliminate the risk for them. So this issue of risk and how it is part of our culture is a fundamental challenge, because right now on this issue, I think it is impeding good decision making. This lack of being able to really admit the nature of risks the way they are in the future. Good question.
Look, we're going to have to leave it there. It's been a fabulous presentation. We're very privileged, as I said at the beginning, very privileged and very honoured. So thank you so much. Thanks so much, Tony. And also just a note to everyone who's with us online, we do have some additional Dig Deeper webinars coming up in the near future. We hope to see you again for those soon.